A lonely mountain man rides into town just to trade his pelts and head back to the high country. But when a stagecoach door opens and a beautiful bride steps down, the whole street goes silent. She looks right at him and says, "Do you recognize me, mountain man?" 15 years ago, he saved a half-frozen orphan girl from a winter massacre. He thought she died long ago, but now she's come back, wearing white, carrying secrets that could burn his world to ashes. The railroad's coming for his land. The law's coming for his past. And the only woman who ever saw goodness in him might be the one to destroy him or redeem him. As snow falls on the Colorado peaks, mercy and justice are about to collide. When the truth rises from the ashes of that old war, will love be enough to save him? Or will the mountain take back what it gave? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The late summer sun beat down on Silver Crossing's dusty main street as Jasper Creed tied his mule outside Henderson's general store. The leather of his worn saddle creaked as he dismounted, his movements stiff from the long ride down from his mountain cabin. A handful of beaver pelts hung from his saddle horn, ready for trade. Inside the store, the familiar smell of coffee beans, leather goods, and tobacco wrapped around him. Old Tom Henderson nodded from behind the counter, used to Jasper's twice-yearly visits for supplies. They conducted their business in comfortable silence. Salt, coffee, ammunition, and other necessities exchanged for the pelts. "Much obliged," Jasper muttered, his voice rough from disuse. He'd spoken to maybe 3 people since spring thaw, and that suited him fine. The mountains were better company than most folks these days. The clock on the store wall showed just past noon when the distant rumble of wagon wheels caught his attention. Through the storefront window, he watched the Denver stagecoach lumber into town, 4 dust-covered horses pulling it to a stop near the Silver Bell Hotel. Jasper lingered inside the store, preferring to let the usual commotion of new arrivals pass before he headed back to his mule. But something made him pause, his scarred hands stilling on the paper-wrapped packages. A young woman descended from the coach, her dove-gray traveling dress catching the sunlight. She moved with a grace that seemed out of place in the rough-hewn town, though there was something familiar in the way she held herself. Her gloved hand gripped a well-worn valise as she glanced around the street, as if searching for someone. Then her eyes found him through the store window. The color drained from her face. The valise slipped from her fingers, hitting the boardwalk with a thud that seemed to echo in the sudden quiet. Several townsfolk had stopped to watch, sensing something unfolding. Jasper felt rooted to the spot as she walked toward the store, her steps measured but trembling. She paused in the doorway, backlit by the harsh mountain sun, and spoke words that sent a jolt through his chest. "Do you recognize me, mountain man?" Her voice was soft but clear, carrying an echo of memory he couldn't quite grasp. Jasper shook his head, reaching for his hat brim. "Ma'am, you must have the wrong fellow. I don't—" "Jasper Creed." She said his name like a prayer, taking another step forward. "You haven't changed as much as you might think." From somewhere outside, he heard Sarah Miller, the blacksmith's wife, gasp. "She means him. She really means Jasper Creed." The young woman's face held shadows of something that tugged at the edges of his memory, something he'd tried hard to forget. Her eyes were the same shade as the mountain sky before a storm, and they looked at him now with a mixture of hope and uncertainty that made his chest ache. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he managed, his voice hoarse. "You're mistaken." Without waiting for her response, he gathered his supplies and pushed past her, out into the harsh sunlight. The watching townsfolk parted before him like water around a stone. His mule stamped impatiently as he secured his packages with hands that wouldn't quite steady. "Please," she called after him, "just let me explain." But Jasper was already in the saddle, turning his mule towards the mountain trail. He didn't look back, though he could feel her gaze following him until the bend in the road took him out of sight. The afternoon light faded to purple dusk as he made his way up familiar switchbacks. His line shack appeared as a dark shape against the gathering night, its sturdy logs offering the solitude he'd come to depend on. But tonight, even as he built up the fire and settled into his routine, something felt different. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls as he tried to focus on his tasks, cleaning his rifle, checking his traps for the next day's work. But his hands kept stilling, his mind returning to that moment in the store. To her face, young but somehow carrying the weight of years he'd rather forget. To the way she'd looked at him like she knew him, really knew him, past all the walls he'd built. He'd seen that look before, hadn't he? Somewhere in the past, in a memory wrapped in snow and gun smoke. The coffee pot bubbled over, startling him from his thoughts. Jasper moved it from the fire with a muttered curse, but the bitter smell only brought back another memory of sharing coffee with a child in a cave during a snowstorm, trying to keep her warm while bullets flew outside. But that child was long gone, along with so many others lost to the violence of the frontier wars. He'd carried that particular guilt for years, adding it to all the others he'd accumulated like river stones in his pockets, weighing him down. Yet something about the young woman's eyes wouldn't let him rest. They held the same quiet strength he remembered from that long-ago child, the same unflinching way of looking straight through a person to their core. It couldn't be her, though. He'd seen the aftermath of that raid, counted the cost in blood and lives. Jasper spent the night by his fire, watching the flames die down to embers. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her standing in that doorway, illuminated by the summer sun, speaking his name like she'd been waiting years to say it, like she'd been looking for him. The way she'd looked at him, like he'd been her salvation once, stirred something he'd thought long buried. A memory of a time when he'd been someone worth looking at that way, before the war and the killing and all the years of solitude had carved him into this hollow shape of a man. As the night deepened, coyotes called from the ridges, their voices echoing off the canyon walls. Usually their songs were company enough, but tonight they seemed to mock his solitude, his certainty that being alone was the only way to atone for his past. The young woman's words played over and over in his mind. "You haven't changed as much as you might think." But he had changed, hadn't he? Changed enough that the face in his shaving mirror was a stranger's. Changed enough that he'd forgotten how to speak to people. Changed enough that the thought of being recognized, really recognized, by another soul sent him running for the hills like a spooked Mustang. Dawn found him still awake, watching the first pale light creep over the eastern peaks. His coffee had gone cold in the tin cup, untouched. The fire had burned down to ash, but he hardly noticed the morning chill. His mind was too full of questions he'd thought he'd buried years ago, stirred up by a pair of storm cloud eyes and a voice that seemed to reach straight through time. Dawn broke over the Colorado highlands, painting the peaks in shades of rose and gold. Jasper hadn't slept more than a handful of minutes, his mind churning with memories he'd thought long buried. As he saddled his mule for the ride back to Silver Crossing, his hands moved through the familiar motions while his thoughts wandered to the woman in the dove-gray dress. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and sage as he descended the switchbacks. His mule's hooves kicked up small clouds of dust, marking their progress toward town. Jasper had rehearsed what he'd say 100 times during his sleepless night. How she must be mistaken. How he wasn't the man she was looking for. How some memories play tricks in the mind. But all his carefully prepared words scattered like leaves in the wind when he rounded the last bend and saw her. She sat on the wooden bench outside the mercantile, her hands folded quietly in her lap. She wore a simpler dress today, practical brown cotton suited to frontier life, but there was still something about her that seemed to belong to a gentler world than his. She watched his approach without surprise, as if she'd known he would return. The morning sun caught the copper highlights in her dark hair, and something about the way she tilted her head made his chest tighten with recognition. Jasper dismounted, his boots raising small puffs of dust as they hit the ground. He looped his mule's reins around the hitching post, using the familiar task to steady himself. "Good morning, Mr. Creed," she said, her voice carrying the same quiet certainty it had held yesterday. "I thought you might come back." "Ma'am," he managed, touching the brim of his hat. "I came to tell you, my name is Mira Colton," she interrupted gently, "and I remember the winter of 1867 very clearly, though I was only a child." Jasper's hand fell from his hat brim. That winter. The memory hit him like a physical blow, snow falling thick and heavy, obscuring the tracks he'd been following. The smell of wood smoke and something worse. The burned wagons half buried in drifts, and the small, still form he'd found huddled beneath an overturned cart. "That's not possible," he said, his voice rough. That child survived," Mira said softly, "because a mountain man found her half frozen and carried her to safety. He wrapped her in his coat and hummed hymns to keep her calm, while bullets flew outside the cave where they sheltered." Jasper's breath caught in his throat. He remembered that hymn. "Amazing Grace," sung low and uncertain, the only one he could recall from his mother's teaching. "You even taught me to pray," she continued, her eyes never leaving his face. "Though you said you weren't much good at it yourself. Just talk to him plain, you told me. He understands frontier talk just fine." The words struck him like physical blows. He'd said exactly that, trying to comfort a terrified child who thought God had abandoned her in the snow. His legs felt suddenly unsteady, and he gripped the porch post for support. "Won't you sit with me, Mr. Creed?" Mira gestured to the bench beside her. "Mrs. Turner at the boarding house makes excellent coffee, and I believe we have much to discuss." He found himself following her into the boarding house, barely noticing the curious glances from other patrons. The coffee was indeed good, steam rising from thick ceramic cups as Mrs. Turner poured and tactfully withdrew. "But you can't be," Jasper said finally, staring into his cup. "That child, there was so much blood in the snow. The raiders came back," Mira finished for him. "Yes, but by then a patrol of cavalry had arrived. They found me delirious with fever but alive, thanks to you. The commander's wife knew the railroad engineer who became my father." She spoke carefully, each word measured as if she'd rehearsed this conversation many times. "He raised me well, sent me to school in Denver. But I never forgot the man who saved me, who showed me kindness when the world had turned cruel." "Your father," Jasper said slowly. "The engineer?" "My adoptive father," she corrected, gently. "He's my only kin now, and he's been good to me. But She paused, turning her coffee cup between her hands. "I've come looking for you deliberately, Mr. Creed. I had to know if you survived, if you were still the same man who risked his life to save a stranger's child." Jasper felt the weight of years of solitude pressing down on him. "I'm not," he said roughly. "That man, he died in the war that followed, in the things he saw, the things he did." "Yet here you are," Mira said quietly, Still in these mountains. Still helping others when you can. Sarah Miller told me how you found her boy when he wandered off last winter. How you've guided lost travelers to safety more times than anyone can count. That's different, he protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Is it? She met his gaze steadily. The man I remember lived by a code of decency, even when the world around him had forgotten what that meant. From what I've heard in town, that hasn't changed. The afternoon slipped away as they talked. Mira told him of her life in Denver, of her father's work with the railroad, of her decision to come west again. She spoke without bitterness of the past, though Jasper could see shadows in her eyes when she mentioned the raid that had left her an orphan. As the sun began to sink toward the mountains, Jasper knew he should head back to his cabin. But something kept him seated, listening to this woman who carried the memory of his better self. Finally, when the shadows had grown long across the boarding house floor, he stood. I should go, he said, reaching for his hat. The trail gets treacherous after dark. Mira nodded, rising as well. Will I see you again, Mr. Creed? He hesitated, his hat brim rough under his fingers. I don't know if that's wise, Miss Colton. Why not? She asked simply. He had no answer that didn't sound hollow, even to his own ears. The ride home through the cottonwoods was quiet, broken only by the sound of his mule's hooves and the evening calls of birds settling for the night. The mountains loomed ahead, their familiar shapes turning purple under the setting sun. But for the first time in years, they didn't offer the comfort of isolation he'd come to depend on. Instead, his mind kept returning to the boarding house table, to the way Mira's hands had cradled her coffee cup, to the clear truth in her eyes when she spoke of remembering him. The past he'd tried so hard to forget had found him, wearing a dove-gray dress and carrying memories of hymns sung in darkness. He'd saved her once. That was true enough. But seeing her now, grown into a woman of quiet strength and grace, made him wonder if perhaps she'd come to save something in him, something he'd thought as dead as that long-ago winter's snow. The mountains caught the last light of day, their peaks blazing briefly gold before fading to shadow. Jasper rode on, the weight of memory and recognition settling around his shoulders like an old familiar coat, heavy with the possibility of redemption he'd never thought to find. The autumn wind whispered through the pines as Jasper chopped wood outside his cabin. 2 days had passed since his conversation with Mira at the boarding house, and he'd thrown himself into preparations for winter, trying to quiet his troubled thoughts. The steady rhythm of the axe helped, each stroke biting deep into the seasoned pine logs. A horse's whinny broke his concentration. He turned, axe half raised, to see Mira Colton riding up the narrow trail to his cabin. She sat straight in the saddle of a sturdy bay mare, her dark riding skirt gathered neatly. Behind the saddle, he spotted a bedroll and several burlap bags. Jasper lowered the axe slowly, frowning. Miss Colton? Mr. Creed. She dismounted with practiced ease, leading her horse forward. I hope you'll pardon the intrusion. It's a fair ride from town, he said carefully. You shouldn't be up here alone. Mira smiled, patting her mare's neck. I brought coffee, she said, reaching into one of the bags. Real mountain coffee, not that weak brew they serve at the boarding house. Before Jasper could respond, she'd tied her horse to a young aspen and was surveying the ridge above his cabin with obvious interest. That's good ground up there, she said, nodding toward a relatively flat stretch beneath the pines. I won't trouble you, Mr. Creed. I just need a place to stay while I decide what comes next. Stay? His voice came out sharper than he'd intended. Miss Colton, you can't possibly. I can, and I will, she said quietly, already unpacking her bedroll. Unless you mean to physically remove me from land that isn't yours to begin with. Jasper ran a hand over his face, feeling the rough scratch of his beard. "It's not proper," he tried again. "A lady alone up here." "I've been alone before," she reminded him, her voice gentle but firm. "And I'm not exactly helpless." She patted the pocket of her riding skirt, where he caught the outline of a small revolver. The sun was westering by the time Mira had her small camp arranged beneath the pines. Despite his protests, Jasper found himself watching with grudging admiration as she efficiently set up her bedroll and a small canvas lean-to. She'd clearly done this before. "You'll freeze come winter," he said finally, watching her bank a small fire. "Then I suppose I'll have to decide my path before then." She straightened, brushing dirt from her skirts. "Now, about that coffee." Somehow, he found himself sharing his evening meal with her beside his own cabin fire. The coffee she'd brought was indeed better than the boarding house brew, rich and strong in his tin cup. She'd contributed fresh bread and dried apple slices to his usual fare of salt pork and beans. "Why are you really here?" he asked finally, as the flames painted shadows across her face. Mira was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "My father, my adoptive father, wants me to marry his business partner," she said at last. "A man who sees nothing wrong in breaking treaties, in pushing people off land they've lived on for generations. He says it's progress." Her mouth twisted slightly. "I've seen enough progress to last a lifetime." "And you think hiding in the mountains is the answer?" "I think finding my own way is the answer." She looked up at him then, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "I've lived among men who care more for railroad profits than right and wrong. Men who'd sell their souls for a percentage point of interest. I won't spend my life that way." "So you'd rather spend it alone on a mountainside?" "I'm not alone," she said simply. "You're here." Jasper had no answer for that. They finished their meal in silence, broken only by the pop and crackle of the fire and the distant cry of a night bird. As Mira gathered her things to return to her camp, she paused. Soft and clear in the gathering darkness, she began to hum. The tune caught at Jasper's heart. Amazing Grace, the very hymn he'd sung to a frightened child in a snow-filled cave 15 years ago. He sat frozen, memories washing over him, the weight of a small body in his arms, the whistle of winter wind outside, his own rough voice trying to comfort a stranger's child while death stalked the mountain passes. "Good night, Mr. Creed," Mira said softly, and climbed the path to her camp. Jasper lay awake long into the night, listening to the familiar sounds of his mountain home, now changed by human presence. Once he thought he heard her humming again, the old hymn floating down from the ridge like a ghost of memory. Dawn found him still restless, emerging from his cabin to find Mira already at work. She stood in the early morning mist, efficiently splitting kindling with his spare axe. Her dark hair caught the first rays of sun, shining like copper wire. She'd tied back her skirts practically and rolled up her sleeves, showing no sign of discomfort at the manual labor. "A mountain winter's no place for a lady," he muttered, more to himself than to her. She looked up, wiping her brow with one sleeve. "Then it's fortunate I'm not much of a lady anymore," she replied calmly. "And you won't face it alone this time." Above them, a red-tailed hawk circled lazily in the warming air, its cry echoing off the rocky slopes. Jasper followed Mira's gaze upward, noting how the aspens near the timberline were already showing hints of gold. Winter would come early this high up, painting the world in frost and silence. But for the first time in years, the thought of the coming season didn't fill him with the usual quiet satisfaction of solitude. Instead, he found himself watching Mira stack her kindling, her movements sure and purposeful, and wondering what changes this winter might bring. The morning light strengthened, burning away the mist and revealing the first signs of autumn creeping down the mountain slopes. Here and there, patches of gold showed among the dark green of the pines. The air carried the sharp scent of wood smoke from Mira's breakfast fire, mixing with the familiar smells of pine sap and sage. Jasper turned back to his own chores, but found his usual routine disturbed by awareness of another presence. The sound of Mira's axe, the occasional snort of her horse, the soft murmur of her voice as she spoke to herself or the animals, all of it wound through his consciousness like new threads in an old familiar weaving. He'd fought so long to maintain his solitude, to keep the world and its complications at arm's length. Now here was this woman, this living reminder of his past, calmly establishing herself on his mountain as if she belonged there, as if the years of careful distance meant nothing. The hawk screamed again, wheeling against the morning sky. Jasper watched it glide away toward the higher peaks, where the first snow would fall before the month was out. He thought of Mira up here in the bitter cold, trying to prove something to herself or to him, and felt an unwelcome surge of concern. But when he looked back at her camp, she was calmly going about her morning tasks, as comfortable in this wilderness as any mountain woman. She'd shed her town clothes for a practical work dress, her hair braided simply down her back. There was something both familiar and strange about her. The child he'd saved transformed into this capable, determined woman. The morning wore on, and Jasper found himself watching her more often than he cared to admit. She moved with quiet purpose, setting up her camp more permanently, gathering kindling, checking her horse's hooves. Every so often she would hum that hymn, the notes drifting down the ridge like fragments of memory. He realized, with a jolt of recognition, that his mountain sanctuary would never be quite the same again. Something had changed, was still changing, as surely as the seasons turned in the high country. The solitude he'd built around himself like armor was developing cracks, letting in glimpses of a world he'd thought he'd left behind forever. The mountain days stretched like taffy, one flowing into the next. Jasper found himself marking time by Mira's quiet presence, the sound of her gathering wood in the morning, the smell of cornbread baking in the afternoon, the soft glow of her lantern at night beneath the pines. She proved herself more capable than he'd expected. One afternoon, he watched from his cabin door as she returned with her apron full of wild raspberries, her fingers stained purple-red from the picking. Another day, she appeared at his door with his old wool shirt, the torn sleeve mended so neatly he could hardly see the repair. "Ain't necessary for you to do that," he muttered, but took the shirt anyway. "I know," she replied simply, "but winter's coming, and you'll need warm clothes." She was right about that. Already the nights were growing sharper, frost gathering on the grass each morning, but Mira seemed unfazed by the dropping temperatures. She'd set up a snug camp, gathering dry firewood and hanging a tarp to keep off the morning dew. Every few days, she rode down to Silver Crossing, returning with flour, coffee, and news from town. Jasper found himself watching her more than he meant to. She moved through his world like she belonged there, quiet, but sure as a deer. Sometimes he caught himself pausing in his work just to track her progress up the hill, or listen to her humming as she worked. The evenings were the hardest to maintain his distance. As darkness fell, she'd often appear at his door with some small offering, fresh bread, dried apples, or just her company. They'd sit by his fire or under his oil lamp, sharing the comfortable silence of people who didn't need words to fill the space between them. Before each meal, Mira would bow her head and pray. "Thank you, Lord, for this mountain, this roof, and the one who kept me alive once," she'd say softly. Jasper would look away, uncomfortable with her gratitude and her faith. He hadn't prayed since the war, since he'd seen too much death to believe in mercy anymore. But something in her quiet devotion stirred memories he'd thought long buried. One evening, as the first snow clouds gathered over the peaks, they heard hoofbeats approaching. Jasper reached for his rifle, but it was just young Tom Watson, the telegram writer from Silver Crossing. "Evening, Mr. Creed," Tom called, dismounting. "Got some news you might want to hear." He nodded respectfully to Mira, who'd appeared in the doorway. "Ma'am?" "Come in from the cold, boy," Jasper said gruffly. "Coffee's still hot." Tom settled by the fire, warming his hands around the tin cup Mira offered. "Colorado and Western Railroad's been marking new timberlands," he said without preamble. "Their survey crew's been through half the territory already." Jasper's face darkened. "What's that got to do with me?" "Well, sir, seems they've got their eye on this valley. Good timber here, they're saying, and the grade's right for a spur line." Out of the corner of his eye, Jasper saw Mira go very still. She was standing by the window, her face in shadow. "Damn railroad thieves," Jasper growled. "Ain't enough they've taken half the territory already? Now they want every acre they can touch." "Survey chief's name is Colton," Tom continued. "Edmund Colton. Says he's got papers from—" The sound of a cup shattering made them both jump. Mira stood frozen, the broken pieces of her coffee cup scattered at her feet. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I'll clean this up." She knelt quickly, gathering the sharp fragments with trembling hands. "Leave it," Jasper said, but she was already heading for the door. "I need some air," she said, her voice tight. The door closed behind her with a soft click. Tom stayed only long enough to finish his coffee and pass on the rest of his news. After he'd ridden away, Jasper stood in his doorway, watching Mira's solitary figure on the ridge. She stood perfectly still, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. Even from this distance, he could see her shoulders shaking. The next morning, Jasper found a half-written letter on her camp table while she was down at the creek washing. He didn't mean to read it, but her words caught his eye before he could look away. "Dear Father, I cannot be part of what you're planning. These mountains are not just timber to be harvested or land to be carved up for profit. They are home to people who—" The letter ended there, crumpled and tear-stained. Jasper backed away, feeling like he'd intruded on something private and painful. When Mira returned, he said nothing about the letter, but he noticed she spent the morning writing and rewriting, only to tear up each attempt. That evening, the silence between them felt different, heavier somehow. Mira seemed lost in thought, staring into the fire as if it held answers to questions she couldn't voice. Jasper wanted to ask about Edmund Colton, about the railroad, about all the things she wasn't saying, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he watched her in the lamplight, noting how the shadows played across her face, how her fingers twisted nervously in her skirts. She looked both younger and older than her years, a woman carrying a burden too heavy for her shoulders. "More coffee?" he offered finally, just to break the silence. She shook her head. "Thank you, no." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were red-rimmed. "I should turn in. It's getting late." He watched her climb the path to her camp, her lantern swaying like a lonely star against the darkness. The weight of unspoken words hung in the air between them, thick as the gathering storm clouds above the mountains. Back in his cabin, Jasper sat long into the night, cleaning his rifle and thinking about change. He'd come to these mountains seeking solitude, trying to outrun memories of war and wilderness violence. He'd built walls around his life, comfortable walls of routine and silence. Now those walls were cracking, letting in complications he'd tried so hard to avoid. Outside, an owl called into the darkness. From up on the ridge, he thought he heard the faint sound of someone crying. He gripped his rifle tighter, fighting the urge to go to her. Whatever demons Mira was wrestling with tonight, they weren't the kind he could shoot. The moon rose over the mountain, casting long shadows through the pines. Somewhere out there, railroad men were marking trees and making plans, drawing lines across the land as if they owned it, as if anything wild and free could truly be owned. Jasper thought of Mira's prayers, her quiet gratitude for this mountain, this roof. He thought of the torn letter in her camp, and the tears she tried to hide. There were connections here he didn't understand yet, threads of story woven together in ways that made his chest tight with worry. But for now, all he could do was wait. Wait and watch as autumn painted the mountains gold, as night frosted the grass silver, as secrets and silence gathered like storm clouds over their shared solitude. Up on the ridge, Mira's lamp finally went dark. The mountain night wrapped around them both, keeper of secrets yet to be revealed, witness to truths yet to be spoken. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. For tonight, there was only the wind in the pines, the cry of a distant coyote, and the weight of things left unsaid. The late September wind carried the bite of approaching winter as Jasper and Mira rode their horses down from the high country. The aspens had turned golden, their leaves rattling like wind chimes in the crisp mountain air. They needed supplies, salt for preserving meat, sugar for winter stores, and the trading post in the lower valley was closer than making the full journey to Silver Crossing. Jasper led the way along the familiar trail, his mule following behind, loaded with pelts to trade. He found himself watching Mira more than the path. She sat her horse well, moving easily with the animal's gait, as if she'd been born to mountain riding. Sometimes he forgot she hadn't always lived this way. They reached the valley floor by mid-morning. The meadow grass rippled silver green in the autumn light, and the creek ran clear and cold over moss-covered stones. But something was different. Something wrong. Jasper reined his horse to a stop, squinting across the familiar landscape. That's when he saw them. Wooden stakes driven into the earth at regular intervals, stretching across his trap lines like invasion markers. "What in blazes?" he muttered, swinging down from his saddle. His boots crunched through frost-covered grass as he strode to the nearest stake. Mira dismounted more slowly, her face troubled. She watched as Jasper bent to examine the marking carved into the wood. "C&W Rail." "Colorado and Western." He spat the words like poison. His hands closed around the stake, muscles bunching as he wrenched it from the frozen ground. "This here's private land. Been deeded since before the war. My old partner Joshua held the papers himself." Mira stepped closer, her boots leaving delicate prints in the frost. Her face had gone pale, and she twisted her gloved hands together. Perhaps we should check the deed at the county recorder's office," she suggested carefully. "In Silver Crossing, to be certain of the boundaries." Jasper turned the stake over in his hands, jaw clenched. 2 days' ride through weather that's turning foul. He glanced at the sky, where steel-gray clouds were gathering over the peaks. "But you're right. Need to settle this proper and legal-like." They abandoned their trading plans and turned toward Silver Crossing. The weather worsened as they climbed back into the high country. Sleet pelted them sideways, coating their coats with ice. The horses picked their way carefully along muddy passes that threatened to turn treacherous with each step. They made camp that night in a sheltered hollow, huddled close to a sputtering fire. Mira's face glowed golden in the firelight as she served up beans and coffee, but her usual gentle chatter was missing. Jasper noticed how she avoided his eyes, how her hands trembled slightly as she passed him his tin cup. The second day of travel was no kinder. They rode through curtains of icy rain, the mud sucking at their horses' hooves. By the time Silver Crossing's church steeple came into view, they were both chilled to the bone and hungry enough to eat leather. But the county recorder's office, when they finally reached it, was locked tight. A sign on the door read, "Closed for Sunday services." Mira stood before the closed door, water dripping from her hood. "We should go to church," she said suddenly. "Get warm at least. Maybe someone there will know when the recorder returns." Jasper shook his head. "You go on. I'll see to the horses." "Please," she touched his arm lightly. "Come in, even if just to get dry." But Jasper remained outside the church, stamping his feet in the mud and listening to the hymns drift through the walls. He was about to head for the livery when the church door opened and Reverend Matthews stepped out. "Jasper Creed," the pastor said warmly, extending his hand. "It's been too long, son." Jasper stared at the offered hand, memories flooding back of summer services in his youth, of his mother's favorite hymns. Slowly, he reached out and clasped the pastor's hand. "Come in where it's warm," Reverend Matthews urged. "Service is nearly over, but you're welcome to join us for the closing hymn." Jasper shook his head. "Much obliged, Reverend, but I've business to tend to." Later, at the boarding house, they sat near the pot-bellied stove, trying to drive the damp from their bones. The dining room was empty except for them, everyone else still at afternoon services. Their wet clothes steamed in the heat, and color had finally returned to Mira's cheeks. She sat very straight in her chair, hands folded in her lap. "There's something I need to tell you," she said quietly. Jasper looked up from his coffee, noting the tension in her shoulders, the way she wouldn't quite meet his eyes. "It's about the railroad," she continued, "about the man leading the expansion." She drew a deep breath. "The survey chief, Edmund Colton, he's my father, my adoptive father, the one who raised me after you saved me." The silence that followed felt heavy as iron. Jasper sat perfectly still, his coffee cooling forgotten before him. Outside, rain drummed against the window panes, and the stove crackled, sending shadows dancing across the walls. "Your father," he finally said, his voice rough. "The one taking my land is your father." "He doesn't know," Mira said quickly. "About you, about what you did for me. I never told him about that winter, about the raid, or how you found me." Her words tumbled out faster now. "I didn't know his plans when I came looking for you. I swear it. I only learned about the railroad's intentions when that telegram writer came—" "Stop." Jasper's voice was quiet but firm. He stood, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "I need to think." He walked to the window, staring out at the rain-slicked street. Church was letting out now, and people hurried past under black umbrellas, headed home to Sunday dinners and warm hearths. Normal lives. Simple lives. Everything he'd thought he'd found again up in his mountains, before stakes appeared in his meadow, and the past came knocking at his door. Behind him, he heard Mira's shaky breath. "I should have told you sooner," she whispered. "I was afraid. Afraid I'd send you away?" He turned back to face her. "Afraid I'd think you were part of their scheme?" "No." She met his eyes at last. "Afraid of hurting you. Afraid of losing whatever peace we've found these past weeks." Jasper's hands clenched at his sides. The rational part of him knew she wasn't to blame for her father's actions. But another part, the part that had learned to distrust anything connected to progress and civilization, wanted to retreat back to his cabin and bar the door against all of it. Railroad men, land speculators, and mysterious women with complicated pasts. The rain continued to fall outside, and the stove hissed as water dripped from their clothes onto its hot surface. In the heavy silence between them, all the unspoken questions hung like smoke, about loyalty and betrayal, about the price of progress and the cost of trust. Jasper looked at Mira, really looked at her. She sat straight-backed but trembling slightly, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She was being brave, he realized, brave enough to tell the truth, knowing it might cost her everything. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of rain and the crackling stove and all the words they hadn't yet found the courage to say. Monday morning dawned gray and cold. Jasper waited on the courthouse steps until the clerk arrived, fumbling with his ring of brass keys. Inside, dust motes danced in the wan light filtering through grimy windows. The clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, adjusted his spectacles as Jasper explained his need. "Land patent, you say, for the Upper Valley?" The clerk shuffled through leather-bound volumes, licking his thumb to turn brittle pages. "What year would that be?" 64, Jasper said. "Maybe 65. His fingers drummed against the wooden counter. "Joshua Blackwood held it first. When he fell at Chattanooga, it passed to me." The clerk's quill scratched across his ledger, checking one entry after another. Mira stood quietly by the pot-bellied stove, warming her hands. She watched Jasper's face grow more troubled with each empty page. "Nothing here," the clerk announced finally, closing the last book with a thump. "No record of any patent or claim in that name. Not in 64, not in 65 neither." "That's impossible," Jasper's voice was rough. "I held that paper myself, kept it safe for Joshua's widow until she passed." "Records don't lie, Mr. Creed." The clerk adjusted his spectacles again. "If you had a patent, it should be here. Without it, well..." He spread his ink-stained hands. "That land belongs to whoever can prove ownership." Jasper's jaw clenched. He nodded curtly and strode out, boots echoing on the wooden floor. Mira hurried after him, gathering her skirts. "We'll find another way," she said, catching up to him on the street. "Perhaps there are other records." "There ain't no other records." He stopped, turning to face her. "That patent was all I had. Without it..." He broke off, staring at the mountains rising blue and distant beyond the town. Mira touched his arm gently. "Don't give up hope yet." But Jasper only shook his head and walked away toward the livery stable, leaving her standing alone in the muddy street. That evening, in her small boarding house room, Mira lit the lamp and opened her trunk. Beneath her dresses and shawls lay a leather portfolio she'd brought from Denver, her father's old papers and blueprints from his early surveying days. Her hands trembled slightly as she began to sort through them. Hours passed. The lamp burned low, shadows growing longer on the faded wallpaper. Her back ached from bending over the documents, but she kept searching. Just before midnight, her fingers found something tucked between two blueprints, a single sheet of paper, folded and yellow with age. Mira's breath caught as she opened it. The writing was faded but still legible. A land patent, dated 1864, bearing Jasper Creed's name. In the margin was a note in her father's precise hand. "Claimed by railroad under eminent domain. File closed." She sank onto the narrow bed, the paper trembling in her hands. Her father had known. He'd taken the patent, buried it among his papers, and claimed the land for his railroad. The truth hit her like a physical blow. This was theft, plain and simple, wrapped in legal words to make it seem right. Tears blurred her vision as she stared at the document. All her life, she'd believed her father to be an honorable man. Stern, perhaps, ambitious, certainly, but never cruel or dishonest. Now this yellowed paper revealed a different truth. The clock on her bedside table ticked away the minutes as she wrestled with her conscience. To return the patent meant betraying her father, the man who'd raised her in comfort and safety. To keep it hidden meant betraying Jasper and herself. Before dawn, she made her choice. She tucked the patent inside her coat, saddled her horse in the gray morning light, and rode out of town toward Jasper's cabin. The sun was just touching the mountain peaks when she found him by the creek, mending his trap line. He looked up at the sound of her horse's hooves, surprise crossing his weathered face. "You're out early." Mira dismounted, her boots crunching on frost-covered grass. Without speaking, she drew the patent from her coat and held it out. Jasper took it slowly, unfolding the brittle paper. His eyes moved across the faded writing, then lifted to her face. "You knew," he said softly. It wasn't a question. She nodded, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I found it last night, among my father's old papers." Her voice wavered but grew stronger. "He took it, Jasper. Years ago. Used eminent domain as an excuse to claim your land." Jasper studied the patent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Why are you showing me this?" he finally asked. "He's your father." "Because I can't serve both truth and my father." The words came easier now, as if speaking them aloud made them more real. "What he did was wrong. I won't be part of it." A chill wind swept down from the mountains, rustling the paper in Jasper's hands. He carefully refolded it and tucked it into his shirt pocket. "This could cost you everything," he said quietly. "Your father's love, your place in society." "I know." Mira wrapped her arms around herself against the cold. "But I've made my choice." They stood in silence as the sun climbed higher, painting the frost-covered meadow in shades of gold. Finally, Jasper nodded toward his cabin. "Got coffee on the stove," he said, "and some biscuits from yesterday." It was as close to forgiveness as he could manage, but Mira understood. She followed him to the cabin, where they shared a simple breakfast in companionable quiet. The wind picked up as evening approached, howling around the eaves and rattling the windows. Jasper built up the fire, while Mira heated beans and the last of the biscuits. They ate without speaking, listening to the wind's mournful song. Both knew that tomorrow would bring its own battles, with the railroad, with her father, with the future itself. But for now, they had found a fragile peace in the simple act of sharing a meal and the warmth of a fire. The patent lay between them on the rough wooden table, its presence both a victory and a wound. Mira watched Jasper's face in the firelight, seeing the weight of memory in his eyes, the cost of trust earned and broken. She had chosen truth over family loyalty, and there would be no going back from that choice. Outside, the wind continued to howl, and somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called to its mate. Inside the cabin, two people who had lost and found each other sat in weary peace, sharing the last of the coffee as night settled over the mountains. The storm came without warning. One moment the afternoon sky held only scattered clouds. The next, a wall of white swept down from the peaks, bringing bitter winds and heavy snow. Jasper had been hauling wood since sunrise, building up the winter store. His shirt was soaked with sweat despite the chill, and his arms ached from the weight of logs. "Best get the last load in quick," he called to Mira, who stood at the cabin door. "This one looks mean." She nodded, wrapping her shawl tighter. "I'll put coffee on. Don't stay out too long." But the storm moved faster than expected. By the time Jasper made his third trip to the woodpile, snow was falling so thick he could barely see 10 feet ahead. The wind cut through his wet clothes like a knife. His fingers, stiff with cold, fumbled with the logs as he struggled to stack them higher in his arms. Inside the cabin, Mira heard him coughing, harsh, racking sounds that made her stomach twist. She opened the door against the wind. "Jasper, come in now before—" He appeared through the curtain of white, stumbling slightly. The wood clattered as he dropped it beside the stove. His face was flushed despite the cold, and his breath came in ragged gasps. "You're burning up," Mira said, pressing her palm to his forehead. "Into bed, right now." Jasper tried to wave her off. "Just need to warm up a spell." But his legs buckled, and he caught himself on the table edge. Mira helped him to his narrow bed, her heart pounding as she felt the heat radiating from his skin. She stripped off his snow-crusted coat and boots, replacing them with every blanket she could find. Outside, the storm howled louder, and snow began drifting against the window panes. Through the night, Jasper's fever climbed higher. He tossed restlessly, muttering words Mira couldn't catch. She kept the fire blazing, melted snow for fresh water, and bathed his face with cool cloths. When he grew restless, she read from the small Bible she kept in her coat pocket, psalms of comfort and protection that her adoptive father had taught her long ago. "Sarah," Jasper called out suddenly, his voice thick with delirium. "Sarah, don't go!" His hand reached out, grasping at empty air. Mira caught his fingers gently. "Shh, rest now. You're not alone." "The winter's too hard," he mumbled. "Should never have brought you out here." His words trailed off into broken sounds of grief. Understanding washed over Mira. Sarah, his wife's name. She'd heard whispers in town about a young bride who hadn't survived her first mountain winter, but Jasper never spoke of it. Now his fever dreams were bringing old wounds to the surface. Through the second day, the storm showed no sign of breaking. Mira dozed in short stretches, waking at every sound from Jasper. She spooned water and broth between his cracked lips, praying constantly under her breath. When his fever spiked dangerous high, she packed snow around his body, her hands shaking with exhaustion. "Lord," she whispered, "don't take him yet. There's too much healing left undone." On the third morning, Jasper's fever finally broke. Mira woke to find him watching her with clear eyes, though his face was drawn with weakness. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. 3 days. She poured fresh water from the kettle. "The storm's still blowing, but you're through the worst now." He sipped slowly, studying her over the cup's rim. "You stayed." "Of course I stayed." She smoothed the blanket across his chest. "You once carried me through the snow, remember? I'm only returning the mercy." Something shifted in Jasper's expression, a softening around his eyes. "Reckon I wasn't much good at accepting mercy before." "Well," Mira smiled, "it's never too late to learn." The storm lasted 5 more days, sealing them in a world of white. As Jasper's strength slowly returned, they passed the hours in quiet companionship. Mira discovered an old hymnal tucked away in his trunk, its pages yellow with age. "This was Sarah's," Jasper said softly when she showed it to him. "She used to sing every evening, even that last winter when things got real bad." He traced the faded cover with gentle fingers. "Haven't opened it since." Mira sat beside his bed, turning carefully through the brittle pages. "Here's one I know, about forgiveness and new mornings." She began to sing softly, her clear voice filling the cabin's shadows. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." She paused, looking at Jasper. After a moment, his rough voice joined hers, uncertain at first, then growing stronger. "I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." They sang together as evening settled over the snow-buried valley. Outside, elk moved like shadows through the storm, their shapes barely visible through the frosted glass. Inside, lamplight cast warm circles on the walls, and the fire crackled steady and strong. As days passed, Jasper regained his strength. He began moving around the cabin, though Mira insisted he rest often. Sometimes she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between wonder and fear, as if he'd discovered something precious but wasn't sure he deserved to keep it. They fell into gentle rhythms. Mira cooked and tended the fire, while Jasper told her stories of the mountains, where the best hunting trails lay, how to read weather in the clouds, which springs never froze even in deepest winter. Each evening, they shared hymns from the old book, their voices growing more certain together. One night, as they finished singing, Jasper said quietly, "Been thinking on what you said about mercy." Mira looked up from where she was mending his coat. "Oh?" "Reckon I spent too many years believing I had to carry everything alone." He stared into the fire. "After Sarah, after losing her, I figured that was God's way of saying I didn't deserve no more chances." "And now?" Mira's fingers stilled on the needle. "Now I'm not so sure." He met her eyes across the lamplight. "Maybe sometimes mercy comes quiet-like, sneaking up when you ain't looking for it." Mira smiled, remembering a frightened girl in the snow and the man who'd carried her to safety. "Maybe it does." The storm finally broke after 8 days, leaving the world transformed under deep drifts. Sunlight sparkled on untouched snow, and the air rang with that special silence that comes after winter storms. Jasper stood in the doorway, breathing deeply of the crisp morning. "Spring will come," Mira said, joining him. "It always does." He nodded slowly. "First time in years I'm looking forward to it." He glanced at her, then back at the brilliant white landscape. "Used to be, winter just brought memories, ghosts of things I couldn't change. But now..." "Now?" she prompted gently. "Now I'm starting to remember there's beauty in these mountains too. And maybe..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Maybe there's more to life than just surviving." Mira slipped her hand into his work-roughened one. He held it carefully, like something precious he feared might break. They stood together in the doorway, watching the sun climb higher over the snow-covered valley, while somewhere in the distance, an elk called to its herd. That night, for the first time since his fever broke, Jasper dreamed. But instead of the old nightmares of loss and grief, he dreamed of spring flowers pushing through melting snow, of new grass greening the valley, of hope as fresh and bright as morning. And in the dream, he wasn't alone. The first warm winds of March swept down from the high peaks, bringing with them the promise of spring. Snow began retreating from the southern slopes, leaving patches of muddy earth exposed to the strengthening sun. Jasper stood on his cabin porch, watching winter's grip slowly loosen on the valley below. Mira joined him, her shawl pulled tight against the morning chill. "The thaw's coming early this year." Jasper nodded, his expression troubled. "Railroad men won't be far behind." "Which is why we should ride down to Silver Crossing now," Mira said carefully. "While the passes are clear enough to travel, we need to record that deed before they try anything else." He turned to study her face, weathered now from months in the mountain air, but still carrying that same quiet determination he'd first seen in her eyes. 2 days down, 2 back. Weather holds, we might make it. Then we should go tomorrow." She touched his arm lightly. "The sooner it's done, the sooner we can breathe easy." That evening, They packed their saddlebags with dried meat, hard biscuits, and coffee. Mira added extra blankets, knowing how treacherous spring weather could be. The morning dawned clear but cold as they set out, their horses picking carefully through the melting drifts. By midday, they'd descended into the lower valley, where patches of green grass were already showing through the snow. The trail was treacherous with mud and half-frozen streams, forcing them to ride slowly. As the sun began to sink, they spotted smoke rising from a small cabin tucked against a stand of aspens. "That's the Morrison place," Jasper said. "Widow woman with young ones. Husband died in a mining accident last fall." They approached the cabin, and Mira's heart tightened at the sight. The woodpile was down to splinters, and no stock moved in the lean-to barn. A thin-faced boy of about 10 years peered out the window, then disappeared. The door opened, and Sarah Morrison stepped out, trying to hide her exhaustion behind a welcoming smile. "Evening, travelers. You're welcome to water your horses at our spring." Mira dismounted, seeing what the proud woman wouldn't say. There were no cooking smells from the cabin, no signs of recent hunting or foraging. 3 small faces watched from the window, the boy and 2 younger girls, all wearing the same look of quiet hunger. "We've got extra supplies," Mira said, already reaching for her saddlebags. "Would you share our supper? It's getting too dark to ride much further." Before the widow could protest, Mira was unpacking coffee, biscuits, and their precious store of dried apples. She saw Jasper slip away with his rifle, but said nothing. An hour later, as she helped Sarah Morrison prepare a simple meal, he returned and silently placed a freshly dressed rabbit by the door. The children's eyes grew wide at the sight of real meat. They ate carefully, making each bite last, while their mother blinked back tears of gratitude. When it was time to leave, Mira divided their remaining supplies, pressing them into Sarah's hands despite her protests. "The Lord provides," Mira said softly, "sometimes through strangers." They made camp a mile down the trail, under a stand of cottonwoods. As they sat by their small fire, Jasper spoke for the first time since leaving the Morrison cabin. "Ain't right, them little ones going hungry?" "No, it's not," Mira added a stick to the flames. "But they won't be now, thanks to that rabbit you left." He shrugged, embarrassed. "Weren't nothing." "It was everything to them." She smiled at him across the fire. "You've got a good heart, Jasper Creed, no matter how you try to hide it." The next afternoon, they rode into Silver Crossing. Word spread quickly through the small town. The mountain hermit was back, and he'd brought his lady with him. Some folks pointed and whispered behind their hands. Others stared openly, especially at Mira in her trail-dusty dress. "Well, if it ain't old Jasper himself," called Ben Tucker from the mercantile porch. "Finally decided to rejoin the living, have you?" Jasper's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Pastor Matthews hurried up, greeting them warmly. "Miss Colton, Mr. Creed, what a blessing to see you both. You'll stay for services tomorrow, of course?" Mira glanced at Jasper, who shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Well, we need to see about recording some papers at the county office, and then—" "Which is closed until Monday," the pastor interrupted smoothly. "Please, I insist. The congregation would be so pleased to have you join us." That evening, they took separate rooms at the boarding house. Mira could hear whispers from the other guests, speculation about her relationship with the notorious mountain hermit, questions about her reputation. She held her head high, remembering the peace she'd found in Jasper's quiet. Strength. Sunday morning dawned bright and clear. Mira wore her best dress, saved from her traveling trunk. When Jasper met her on the boarding house porch, she saw he'd trimmed his beard and combed his hair, though he looked uncomfortable in his clean shirt. The little church was crowded with familiar faces: the blacksmith and his wife, the telegraph operator, ranch hands, and shopkeepers. Conversations hushed as Jasper and Mira entered, but Pastor Matthews welcomed them warmly, leading them to a pew near the front. When the congregation stood to sing, Mira's voice rose clear and strong, though she felt it trembling with emotion. To her surprise, Jasper joined in, his deep bass carrying the familiar hymns they'd practiced through the winter nights. Pastor Matthews took his text from the Book of Ruth, speaking of second chances and the courage to begin again. "Sometimes," he said, looking out over his congregation, "we think we're beyond grace. We build walls of loneliness, convince ourselves we're better off alone. But God sends us companions on the journey, not to erase our past, but to help us build a future." Mira felt Jasper stiffen beside her. When she glanced over, she saw moisture in his eyes, quickly blinked away. His hand found hers in the space between them, rough fingers closing gently around her own. After the service, while Mira spoke with the pastor's wife, Jasper drew Pastor Matthews aside. Their conversation was brief and quiet, but Mira caught the words, "marriage license," and saw the pastor's face break into a broad smile. Later, as they walked back to the boarding house, Jasper cleared his throat. "Reckon we should talk about what comes next." Mira's heart quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "What did you have in mind?" He stopped, turning to face her. "Been thinking on what the pastor said, about second chances, about building something new." His eyes met hers, vulnerable but determined. "I ain't much for fancy words, but if you're willing to take on an old mountain hermit, I'd be honored to make things proper between us." Mira felt tears welling up. "Are you asking me to marry you, Jasper Creed?" "Suppose I am." He reached for her hand. "You brought light back into my life, Mira. Made me remember what it means to hope again. I can't offer much beyond a mountain cabin and a heart that's still learning to trust, but—" She stopped his words with a gentle finger to his lips. "You offer everything I've ever wanted. Truth, kindness, and a love that grows stronger each day." She smiled through her tears. "Yes, I'll marry you." Relief and joy washed over his weathered face. They stood there in the Sunday quiet, hands clasped, while the spring sun warmed the awakening earth around them. Tomorrow they would record the deed, securing their claim to the mountain valley. But today, in this moment, they had claimed something far more precious: a future built on trust, forgiveness, and the courage to love again. The morning sun streamed through the chapel's tall windows, casting golden light across worn wooden pews. Outside, meadowlarks called their spring songs, and the scent of wild plum blossoms drifted through the open door. Silver Crossing's townsfolk filed in, their Sunday best freshly pressed, curiosity written plain on their faces. "Never thought I'd see the day," Ben Tucker whispered to his wife. "Old Jasper cleaning up and taking a bride." Sarah Morrison sat near the back with her children, all three scrubbed clean and wide-eyed. The young boy wore a too-large suit coat borrowed from the pastor's son. His sisters had wild flowers tucked in their hair, a gift from Mira that morning. At the front of the chapel, Jasper Creed stood awkwardly in a new shirt, his beard trimmed neat and close. His weathered hands kept fidgeting with his collar until Pastor Matthews placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. The morning light caught the silver at his temples, and for once, the hard lines around his eyes had softened. The small congregation rustled and turned as Mira appeared in the doorway. She wore a simple white dress borrowed from Mrs. Matthews, altered hastily the night before. Her dark hair was braided with white ribbons, and she carried a bouquet of early spring violets gathered from the sunny side of the valley. Jasper's breath caught at the sight of her. She moved down the aisle with quiet grace, her eyes never leaving his. When she reached his side, she smiled up at him with such trust that his hands steadied at last. Pastor Matthews opened his Bible, his voice warm and clear in the hushed chapel. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the sight of God and this company." The familiar words washed over them as sunlight filled the chapel. Mira's hand trembled slightly in Jasper's as they turned to face each other. When it came time for the vows, Jasper's voice was rough with emotion, but steady. "I, Jasper Creed, take thee, Mira Colton, to be my wedded wife." He paused, swallowing hard, then continued in words that came straight from his heart rather than the prayer book. "I vow to protect you and cherish you as long as breath remains in my body, to walk beside you in faith and truth, and to love you with all that I am." Tears filled Mira's eyes as she repeated her own vows, her voice clear and sure. "I, Mira Colton, take thee, Jasper Creed, to be my wedded husband. I promise to stand with you through all seasons, to share your joys and sorrows, and to love you faithfully until my last breath." When Pastor Matthews pronounced them man and wife, Jasper kissed her with gentle reverence. The congregation broke into surprised applause, led by Sarah Morrison's children. "Let us join together in singing Amazing Grace," Pastor Matthews announced, and the old hymn rose up, filling the chapel with hope. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." Mira's voice soared clear and true, and even Jasper joined in, his deep bass carrying the familiar words. The sound wrapped around them like a blessing, and for a moment the watching faces softened with genuine joy for the mountain hermit and his bride. After the ceremony, they gathered at the pastor's home, where Mrs. Matthews had prepared a wedding supper. The long table groaned with chicken and dumplings, fresh bread, and early spring greens. Children darted between the adults' legs, snatching cookies from platters and giggling at their own daring. To everyone's surprise, Jasper seemed at ease among them. He sat at the head of the table, Mira beside him, and actually smiled as Sarah Morrison's youngest daughter climbed into his lap to share her dessert. The stern lines of his face had melted away, replaced by a contentment no one had ever seen there before. "More coffee, Jasper?" Mrs. Matthews asked, and he nodded, reaching for Mira's hand under the table. "Much obliged, ma'am. Everything's just fine." The afternoon light began to fade into evening, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. One by one, the guests took their leave, offering awkward but sincere congratulations to the new couple. "You've given this town something to talk about for months," Pastor Matthews said warmly as he walked them to their horses. "But more importantly, you've given us all a reminder that love can bloom in the most unexpected places." Mira hugged Mrs. Matthews, whispering thanks for the borrowed dress and all her kindness. Jasper shook the pastor's hand, words of gratitude stuck in his throat but showing clear in his eyes. They mounted their horses as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The road home stretched before them, familiar yet somehow new. They rode at an easy pace, content in the companionable silence between them. The evening air grew cool and damp as they followed the creek toward the mountains. Frogs sang their spring chorus from the thawing marsh, a sound both ancient and full of renewal. Jasper reached across the space between their horses to take Mira's hand, and they rode that way for a time, connected in the gathering dark. Their cabin appeared ahead, a square of lamplight glowing in the window. Mrs. Matthews had sent one of her boys up earlier to light the fire and leave a basket of wedding gifts, fresh bread, preserves, and a new quilt sewn by the church ladies. Jasper helped Mira down from her horse, then led both animals to the barn. When he returned, she stood in the doorway of their home, her white dress ghostly in the starlight. He paused, struck by the rightness of her there, as if she'd always belonged. "Welcome home, Mrs. Creed," he said softly, and lifted her across the threshold. Inside, the lamp cast a warm glow over the familiar cabin, now transformed by Mira's presence these past months. Her books stood neat on the shelf beside his father's old Bible. The new quilt added color to his narrow bed. Even the air seemed different, carrying the scent of fresh bread and early, spring flowers she'd gathered that morning. Neither noticed the lone rider who watched from the shadow of the pines. He sat motionless until the lamp was extinguished, then turned his horse toward the trail that led to Denver. The sound of his departure was lost in the chorus of frogs and the whisper of wind through the trees. In the cabin, Jasper and Mira stood together in the quiet dark, their hearts beating in time with the ancient rhythm of the mountains. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight belonged to them alone, a gift of grace neither had expected to find so late in life. The lamp's glow spilled soft light across the wooden floor as Jasper drew Mira close. No words were needed as they stood together, husband and wife at last, their union as quiet and true as the stars wheeling overhead. In that moment, the past's shadows seemed to fade, leaving only the promise of days to come. The spring morning dawned crisp and clear, 3 days after the wedding. Jasper worked steadily at the woodpile behind their cabin, his axe rising and falling in a familiar rhythm. Mira hummed as she kneaded bread dough at the table, watching through the window as wood chips flew with each precise stroke. The domestic peace of the scene wrapped around her like a warm shawl. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the morning quiet. Jasper paused, axe mid-swing, as 2 riders emerged from the tree line. Their badges caught the sunlight, a United States Marshal and his deputy, faces grim beneath their wide-brimmed hats. "Morning, folks," the Marshal called out, dismounting with practiced ease. He was a tall man with iron-gray hair and weathered features. His deputy, younger and wire-thin, remained mounted, one hand resting near his holster. Mira wiped flour from her hands and stepped onto the porch. "Welcome, gentlemen. Would you care for coffee? The bread will be ready shortly." "Much obliged, ma'am," the marshal replied, touching the brim of his hat. "I'm Marshal Thaddeus Boone. This here's Deputy Wilson." Jasper set down his axe and approached slowly, nodding to the lawman. His face remained impassive, but Mira noticed the slight tension in his shoulders. Inside the cabin, Mira poured coffee into tin cups while the marshal pulled a folded paper from his vest. The morning light streaming through the window caught the official seal, and something in Mira's chest tightened with sudden dread. "What brings you up the mountain, Marshal?" Jasper asked quietly. Marshal Boone unfolded the warrant with careful fingers. "Best you see for yourself, Mr. Creed." Mira took the paper with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the formal text. The coffee cups clattered forgotten on the table as the words burned into her mind. "For the willful murder of a Ute youth in the winter of 1867? Her gaze jumped to the bottom of the page, and her heart nearly stopped. There, beneath the territorial judge's signature, was another name she knew, all too well, her father's. "No," she whispered, looking up at Jasper. "This can't be right." Jasper stood very still, his face carved from stone. "I spared that boy," he said softly, the words heavy with memory. "The warrant's legal, ma'am," Marshal Boone said, not unkindly. "I'm duty-bound to take him in." The deputy entered with iron shackles that gleamed dully in the morning light. Mira watched in horror as they were locked around Jasper's wrists, the sound of metal clicking shut like a gunshot in the quiet cabin. "Please," she begged, turning to the marshal. "There must be some mistake. We were just married 3 days ago. He's a good man." "The law must take its course, Mrs. Creed," Marshal Boone replied. "He'll get a fair hearing before the circuit judge." Outside, the deputy had brought up the prison wagon. Jasper allowed himself to be led to it without resistance, his back straight and proud despite the chains. Just before climbing in, he turned to Mira. "Truth will out," he said quietly. "Keep faith." Mira grabbed her bonnet and mounted her mare as the wagon started down the mountain trail. The white ribbons she'd worn at their wedding still decorated the brim, whipping in the wind as she followed behind. Each turn of the wheels seemed to mock the brief happiness they'd found. The journey to Silver Crossing stretched endless. Dust clouded behind the wagon, and the spring wind carried a bitter edge. Mira's mind raced through memories of that long-ago winter, smoke rising from burning wagons, blood staining the snow, a child's terrified cries. But she remembered something else too, Jasper's gentle hands as he carried her to safety, his quiet voice humming hymns through the night. The sun was setting by the time they reached town. Curious faces peered from windows and doorways as the prison wagon rumbled down the main street. Mira heard the whispers start, spreading like wildfire. "The Mountain Hermit. Murder. 15 years ago. Ute boy." The jail stood at the edge of town, a squat building of gray stone. Mira watched helplessly as Jasper was led inside. Through the barred window, she caught a last glimpse of his face, still calm despite everything. "You can see him tomorrow during visiting hours," Marshal Boone told her. "Best go home and rest now, ma'am." But Mira couldn't face returning to their empty cabin. Instead, she turned her tired mare toward the church. The building stood dark and silent against the purple dusk, but Pastor Matthews had given her a key when she joined the congregation. Inside, the church smelled of beeswax and old wood. Mira lit a single lamp and knelt in the front pew, her wedding dress still hanging in the vestry where she'd changed just 3 days ago. The happiness of that morning seemed to mock her now. "Dear Lord," she whispered into the darkness, "please help me understand. Show me the truth of what happened that day. Help me keep faith." But as she prayed, other memories surfaced, the chaos of the raid, the screams of the wounded, the thick smell of gun smoke. She had been so young, seeing everything through a child's frightened eyes. What if she had missed something vital? What if Jasper... No. She pushed the doubts away, remembering instead his gentle hands checking her for fever, his patient teaching as she learned to survive the mountain winters. The man she knew could never have murdered a child. A floorboard creaked, and she looked up to find Pastor Matthews standing in the doorway, concern etched on his kind face. "I heard about Jasper," he said softly. "The whole town's talking." Mira wiped her eyes. "My father signed the complaint. After everything, how could he do this?" The pastor sat beside her, his presence steady and comforting. "Sometimes men do wrong things believing they serve right ends. But God sees all hearts, child. Truth has a way of coming to light." "I'm afraid," Mira admitted. "Not of what they say he did. I know in my heart he's innocent. I'm afraid of what my father might do next." "Then we'll pray together," Pastor Matthews said simply, and his warm voice filled the dark church with familiar words of comfort. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Mira joined in, the ancient psalm steadying her racing thoughts. But even as she prayed, her mind kept returning to that terrible winter day. Through the haze of memory, she struggled to recall every detail, knowing somewhere in those fractured images lay the key to saving Jasper. The lamp flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind moaned around the church's corners like a lost soul. Mira remained kneeling in the darkness long after Pastor Matthews had gone, her prayers mixing with memories of blood and smoke, while in the jail cell across town, Jasper Creed faced his own demons in the gathering night. Dawn broke cold and gray over Silver Crossing. Mira stood at the telegraph office, her gloved hands trembling as she composed her message. The operator, Mr. Jenkins, waited patiently as she carefully wrote each word. 2. Indian Agent, Fort Garland Stop. Seeking survivors of 1867 White River Incident Stop. Urgent testimony needed regarding Jasper Creed and Ute Boy Stop. Will compensate travel expenses. Stop. Reply Silver Crossing Telegraph Office. Stop. Mr. Jenkins's fingers clicked out the message, the sound sharp and decisive in the quiet morning. That'll be 50 cents, Mrs. Creed. Mira counted out the coins, precious money from their wedding funds. Outside, the town was coming to life, shutters opening and smoke rising from chimneys. She walked toward the jail, carrying a basket with fresh bread and water. Marshal Boone nodded as she entered. He'd grown accustomed to her daily visits, treating her with gruff courtesy. 10 minutes today, ma'am. Judge wants to see him after. Jasper sat on his thin bunk, somehow maintaining his dignity despite the iron bars and rough conditions. His face brightened at her approach, though worry lined his eyes. I've sent a message to Fort Garland, Mira told him, passing bread and water through the bars. Someone must remember. 15 years is a long time, Jasper said softly, and memories can twist like smoke in the wind. Around town, Mira heard the whispers grow louder with each passing day. Some folks, like Pastor Matthews and the blacksmith's wife, brought food and spoke kindly of Jasper's quiet help over the years, the times he'd rescued stranded travelers or shared game with hungry families. Others muttered darker things. Always knew there was something wrong with that mountain hermit, the saloon keeper declared. Man don't live alone that long without reason. 5 days crawled past. Mira divided her time between the jail, the telegraph office, and the church. Her prayers grew more desperate as each day brought no word from Fort Garland. On the morning of the 5th day, the sound of hoofbeats drew everyone's attention. A rider appeared through the morning mist, a tall man with gray hair bound in traditional Ute style, sitting straight and proud on a paint horse. His weathered face carried both wisdom and sorrow. He dismounted carefully in front of the jail, his movements deliberate. Mira, who had been bringing Jasper his breakfast, stepped outside to meet him. I am Henry Red Elk, he said, his voice soft but carrying authority. I received word you seek truth about Jasper Creed. Mira's heart leaped. Yes, please, come inside. Marshal Boone needs to hear this. The marshal looked up from his desk as they entered, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun before relaxing. Henry Red Elk commanded respect without speaking a word. I have come to testify, Henry said simply, about the boy Jasper Creed is accused of killing. From his cell, Jasper had gone very still. His eyes met Henry's, and something passed between them, recognition, perhaps, or shared memory of that bloody day. Henry turned to Marshal Boone. That boy was my brother. Jasper Creed did not kill him. He saved him. The marshal's eyebrows rose. That's a serious claim, Mr. Red Elk? You have proof? I have better than proof, Henry replied. I have the boy himself, now a man. My son by adoption, teaching our children at the reservation school. Mira pressed her hands to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. Jasper leaned against the cell bars, his face showing raw emotion for the first time since his arrest. The boy lived? He whispered. Henry nodded. You wrapped him in your own coat, left him where our scouts would find him. I was one of those scouts. We found him before the storm hit, alive, unharmed. Marshal Boone scratched his chin thoughtfully. This needs to go before the judge. Wilson, he called to his deputy. "Fetch Judge Parker. Tell him it's urgent." The next hour brought a flurry of activity. Judge Parker arrived, still pulling on his coat. The pastor came to witness, along with several town elders. They gathered in the jail's front room as Henry Red Elk told his story. "It was a bad time," he began, his voice carrying the weight of history. "Much anger, much fear on both sides. The boy, my brother, was separated from our people during the fighting. Jasper Creed found him." The room was silent as Henry continued. "Instead of killing him, as many would have done, he showed mercy, protected him from others who would have done him harm, left him where he knew our people would search." Judge Parker leaned forward. "And you're certain this is the same incident, the same man?" Henry's eyes were steady. "I carry the scar from that day." He touched his shoulder. "I saw Jasper Creed then, through smoke and snow. I see him now. He has not changed so much that I would forget the man who saved my brother." The judge turned to Jasper. "Is this true, Mr. Creed?" Jasper nodded slowly. "I couldn't do it," he said quietly. "Couldn't kill a child, no matter whose side he was on. Didn't know if he lived or died after I left him. Been carrying that weight ever since." "The boy, my son now, would come himself to testify," Henry added. "But winter classes cannot spare their teacher. He sends this instead." He withdrew a folded paper from his vest, a carefully written letter in clear, educated handwriting. Judge Parker read it silently, then looked up at Marshal Boone. "This changes everything. The charges were false to begin with." "Reckon we ought to release him then," the marshal said, already reaching for his keys. The sound of the cell door opening seemed to echo through the room. Jasper stepped out slowly, as if unsure of his freedom. Mira rushed to embrace him, her tears soaking his shirt. Outside, the first snowflakes of a late spring storm began to fall. Henry Red Elk stood at the window, watching them drift down. "Same weather as that day," he said softly. "The Great Spirit has a way of bringing truth full circle." Jasper crossed to stand beside him. "I never knew your brother lived," he said. "Never knew what became of him." "He became a man of peace," Henry replied, "teaching our children to read, to write, to bridge the gap between our peoples. Your mercy that day bore good fruit." The snow fell harder now, white against the darkening sky. Mira watched as Jasper and Henry spoke quietly together. Two men bound by an act of compassion in a time of violence. Pastor Matthews began a prayer of thanksgiving, his voice mingling with the soft whisper of snow against the windows. Through the swirling white, the past and present seemed to merge, the same month, the same snow, but this time bringing healing instead of harm. Jasper reached for Mira's hand, his grip warm and sure, as the town witnesses filed out into the gathering storm. Judge Parker called the town hall to order, his gavel echoing through the packed room. Morning light filtered through frosted windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Townsfolk filled every bench, their breath visible in the chilly air. Henry Red Elk stood before the judge's table, his dignity commanding silence. "I will speak of what happened that winter day," he began, his voice carrying to every corner. "When the soldiers came to our camp, there was no warning, no chance for peace." The crowd leaned forward, hanging on his words. Jasper sat rigid beside Mira, his face pale but composed. "Through smoke and gunfire, I saw Jasper Creed," Henry continued. "He found my brother, wounded and afraid. Instead of finishing what others had started, he lifted the boy in his arms, carried him through rifle fire to safety." Henry's hand unconsciously touched his own old wound. "He wrapped the child in his coat, left him where our scouts would find him. Then he turned back to face the soldiers' anger." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Henry's eyes found Jasper's. The soldiers did not want witnesses to their shame. They burned everything. The wagons, the bodies, even the snow was black with ash. But they could not burn the truth. The courthouse doors opened with a blast of cold air. A well-dressed man in a railroad coat entered, escorted by 2 deputies. Mira stiffened. Her adoptive father, William Colton, looking less confident than his usual Denver boardroom manner. "Engineer Colton," Judge Parker called. "Step forward. You've heard these accusations. What say you to them?" Colton straightened his vest. "Ancient history, Your Honor. Unproven claims about events long past. What matters is the present. The railroad's legal right to stolen land?" Henry interrupted, producing the weathered patent from his vest. "This deed bears your company's seal, yet was found among your private papers. Papers you took from this courthouse 15 years ago." The engineer's face reddened as Henry handed the document to Judge Parker. The judge examined it carefully, holding it to the light. "This is genuine," Parker declared. "Filed and recorded in 1867. The official seal is intact." He fixed Colton with a hard stare. "Explain how it came to be in your possession." Sweat beaded on Colton's forehead despite the cold. He glanced at his daughter, but Mira's eyes were steel. The crowd's whispers grew louder. "The land was vital to the railroad's expansion," he finally said, his voice breaking. "When I found the deed during the initial survey, I took it. Then when Creed resisted our claims, He swallowed hard. "I fabricated the murder charge, using old records of the massacre. I thought no one would question it after so many years." The room erupted in angry mutters. Judge Parker's gavel cracked like thunder. "Order!" he commanded. When silence fell, he turned to Jasper. "Mr. Creed, you stand fully cleared of all charges. Engineer Colton, you will remain in custody pending charges of theft and perjury." "The patent is restored to its rightful owner," Parker continued. "This case is dismissed." The heavy doors swung wide. Mira ran to Jasper as he stepped into freedom, tears streaming down her face. He caught her hands in his touch gentle despite the strength in his weathered fingers. "It's over now," he said softly, and in those 3 words lay healing for 15 years of silence. The townsfolk rose, their applause starting slow, then building like rolling thunder. Outside, the church bells began to ring, their bright voices carrying across the snow-hushed valley. Henry Red Elk smiled, touching his heart in a gesture of respect before turning to leave. Through the windows, snow continued to fall, each flake carrying its own small light, as if nature itself celebrated the return of truth to Silver Crossing. Jasper held Mira close, their shadows merging in the pale winter sun, while justice settled over them like a blessing. The mountain spring arrived like a painting coming to life. Snowmelt filled the streams until they sang through the valley, and tender green shoots pushed through dark earth toward the brightening sky. At the cabin, Jasper and Mira watched their world transform with quiet joy. Henry Red Elk came to help them, his skilled hands guiding the restoration of the old bunkhouse. Together they replaced rotted boards, patched the roof, and added windows to let in the sweet mountain air. "A home needs light," Henry said, showing them how to seal the glass panes with careful precision. Mira spent evenings writing letters by lamplight to the Missionary Society in Denver, requesting books, blankets, and supplies for their new purpose. Her pen scratched across paper as she described their vision. A refuge where children of any background could find shelter and love. Jasper rode into Silver Crossing weekly, speaking with the pastor and townspeople about their plans. Some folks doubted at first, but his quiet conviction won them over. Soon wagons began arriving with donated furniture, clothes, and food for the children they would welcome. Their first three arrived as spring bloomed fully. Tommy, age 8, had lost his parents to fever during the hard winter. Sarah, a 10-year-old Navajo girl, came from the overcrowded agency school with Henry's help. Baby Grace, barely 6 months old, survived the wagon accident that took her parents on the pass. Each evening, they gathered around the table Jasper had built, sharing simple meals of beans, bread, and whatever game the traps provided. The children's laughter filled spaces that had known only silence. After supper, Jasper told stories of mountain wisdom, how to read weather in the clouds, track elk through deep woods, and respect the land's ancient ways. When darkness fell, Mira's voice rose clear and sweet, teaching them hymns that echoed off the log walls. The children curled in their beds, safe and warm, while she sang of grace and morning light. One evening, as purple twilight settled over the peaks, Jasper stood watching smoke curl from their chimney. The scent of pine mingled with cooking smells, and children's voices drifted through the window. His scarred hands rested on the split-rail fence as he whispered, barely audible, "Didn't think I'd ever deserve this." Autumn painted the mountains in rich golds and deep reds, transforming Silver Crossing into a canvas of harvest colors. The morning air held the first hints of winter's approach when the newly mounted school bell rang out across the ridge, its clear tone echoing through the valley. Children rushed from Jasper and Mira's cabin, their boots crunching through fallen leaves as they headed to their lessons. Tommy, now 9, helped little Grace toddle along while Sarah carried their slate boards. Other children from neighboring homesteads joined them on the path, their voices mixing with the crisp mountain breeze. By midday, horses' hooves thundered up the trail. Henry Red Elk appeared with a tall, dignified man riding beside him. His son, James, the boy Jasper had carried to safety 15 years before. Jasper stood frozen on the porch, his eyes meeting those of the grown man who had once been that wounded child. "Welcome," Mira called out warmly, bringing coffee and fresh bread to the table outside. They sat together in the autumn sunshine, the past's shadows dissolving in shared laughter and quiet understanding. James spoke of his teaching work at the reservation school, while Henry told stories of the old days, their words free from the bitterness that had once defined those memories. As the sun began its descent behind the peaks, the children returned home, their chatter filling the yard. Mira stood in the doorway, wrapping her white shawl around her shoulders. The fading light caught the wool's weave, making it glow against the firelight spilling from within. Jasper moved to stand beside her, taking her hand in his weathered one. His voice was soft but clear as he spoke. "Now I recognize what grace looks like." Mira's eyes sparkled as she turned to him, squeezing his hand gently. "It's been looking back at you all along." Night settled over the valley like a gentle blanket. Through the cabin's window, lamplight cast warm squares on the ground outside. Inside, the sound of children's laughter gradually gave way to the sweet notes of evening hymns. The great mountain stood sentinel above them, unchanged and eternal, its ancient face bearing witness to the power of mercy restored and hearts made whole again. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.